They hung a bright red, dangerous sign on his cage and gave him a deadline: adopted or euthanized. At the edge of a quiet Midwestern town, a lonely veteran named Daniel Hartley signs the paper anyway and takes the scarred German shepherd home, thinking he's just giving one more broken soul a soft place to grow old. Days later, he finds the back door of his friend Ellen's diner kicked in, the smell of gasoline still hanging in the air, and a note that orders him to bring the dog and the storage keys to an abandoned train depot, or watch Ellen and her little grandson pay the price. Stay with this story and ask yourself, did Daniel save this dog from death? Or did God send this dog to save them all? The wind came in low off the fields that evening, sliding between the metal storage units and rattling their roll-up doors like a loose chorus of tin drums. Out beyond the last row of units, the land flattened into corn stubble and dark. And farther still, the faint orange glow of town smeared the edge of the Midwestern sky. Daniel Hartley walked his usual line down the gravel lane, boots crunching, hands deep in the pockets of his red and black plaid jacket. He was 59, maybe a year or two past the age he liked to admit, with shoulders that had once carried more muscle and more weight than they did now. His hair, cut short out of habit, had gone mostly gray at the temples. Lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, softening what might otherwise have been a hard face. Tonight, like most nights, those eyes moved from lock to lock, door to door, reading the steel and padlocks the way other men read newspapers. It was simple work, watching over a storage yard and a row of old tow trucks for the local garage. But it was honest, and it kept his hands busy when the sun went down and memories got loud. Earlier that afternoon, he had helped Mrs. Callahan, who was somewhere north of 70, lift a box of winter clothes into her unit while she told him about her grandson in college. He'd jump-started a teenager's dead pickup without making a speech about checking batteries before winter. And he'd changed a flickering bulb over Unit 12 because nobody else remembered it was there. Those were the kinds of things he did now. Small, repairable problems. The sort that didn't bleed out in the sand while a helicopter beat at the sky and refused to land in time. When the wind shoved a door and he heard the hollow boom of metal, his shoulders tensed before he could stop them. An old reflex from a decade in a combat rescue unit. Sometimes, on nights when the air came in just right, the rattle of sheet metal sounded too much like rotor wash and distant shouting. And for a heartbeat, Daniel wasn't in a storage yard. He was 24 again, kneeling in dust that smelled of cordite and fear. Hands pressed against a chest he could not keep closed. He shook the thought away, as he always did, with the practiced motion of someone pushing a picture back into a drawer. He checked the last padlock, gave the tow truck lot a final look, then flicked off the office light and stepped through the chain-link gate, letting it sigh shut behind him. Out here, at the edge of town, the streets were narrower, the houses smaller, and the stars brighter when the clouds cooperated. Daniel's place was a modest single story at the very end of a quiet road. A rented thing with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked when you looked at it too hard. Inside waited a worn sofa, a coffee pot on an old timer, and a television that mostly played games with the volume low. They were faithful enough companions in their way. But they did not talk back, and they did not ask how he was sleeping. His left wrist bore a military-style watch, the same kind he had worn overseas, though the strap was new and the numbers easier to read. Sometimes he glanced at it and measured the distance between now and then, between the man he had been and the man who walked storage lanes for a living. On this particular evening, instead of turning straight toward home, his boots angled toward Main Street, following habit more than intention. The town fire station sat a block off the main drag, a square brick building with a white bay door and a flag that snapped in the wind. Daniel often cut past it on his way home, the way a former parishioner might walk by a church without going in, nodding at the familiar silhouette of the trucks behind the glass. The big doors were closed now, but the lobby lights were on, throwing a soft rectangle of yellow onto the sidewalk. As he drew level with the front windows, something on the bulletin board just inside the glass caught his eye. A sheet of paper, taped crookedly, with bold black letters that seemed to lean toward him. He paused, breath puffing in a small cloud. Stepping closer, he cupped a hand to the glass to cut the reflection. The flyer was a cheap photocopy, the ink slightly smudged where someone's thumb had brushed it. At the top, in block capitals, it read, "German Shepherd, declared dangerous, needs immediate rescue." Beneath the words was a grainy picture of a dog with pricked ears and dark, intelligent eyes that blurred at the edges from over-enlargement. No name, just a number, and a line in smaller print. To be euthanized, if not placed by end of week. The word euthanized sat in his chest like a stone. Dangerous, he thought, tasting the word, the way he might test a sore tooth. It was a word people used when they were afraid of something they didn't fully understand. An explosive charge, a neighborhood, a man home from war who flinched at fireworks. He knew what it was to be labeled for other people's comfort, to be filed under too much trouble or not worth the risk. The dog's eyes in the photograph were hard to read, fuzzy as they were, but there was something in the tilt of the head, the set of the ears, that spoke of attention rather than madness. A working dog, he guessed automatically. Maybe police, maybe military, maybe just a yard guardian who'd been given the wrong kind of job with the wrong kind of people. His reflection floated over the picture. Lined face, gray hair, the plaid jacket that had seen a dozen winters. A lonely veteran, they would have called him in one of the stories folks passed around on the internet. The phrase made him want to snort and look away, but his hand stayed on the glass. He imagined what it must be like on the other side of whatever door that dog was behind tonight. The smells of disinfectant and fear, the echo of other dogs barking, the sense, he knew it too well, of time running out while strangers decided your fate with forms and checkboxes. He was too old for another responsibility, he told himself. His knees complained on stairs. His back had a way of seizing up in cold weather. And some mornings it took 2 cups of coffee before his hands stopped shaking from dreams he didn't discuss. Bringing a dangerous animal into that quiet, fragile balance sounded like the kind of bad idea younger men made when they were still collecting scars. Yet he did not walk away. He stood there in the chill evening, wind needling at the back of his neck, and let the silence fill with questions he didn't quite want to answer. The last time a life had been placed, even indirectly, in his hands, he had failed. And that memory had followed him all the way to this small town and its rows of metal doors. Now, here was another life, flattened to ink and paper, waiting for someone foolish or stubborn enough not to look away. Daniel drew in a slow breath, eyes still locked on the blurred gaze of the German shepherd, and wondered, without daring to say it out loud, whether he had anything left in him to offer a creature the world had already given up on. The animal shelter sat in the shadow of the old brick church, tucked behind it like an afterthought. In daylight, it might have looked almost cheerful with its chain-link runs and a hand-painted sign. But in the gray wash of the late morning, it seemed smaller. The gravel lot half frozen, and the air holding the faint sour tang of disinfectant and wet fur. Daniel stood for a moment outside the low door, one hand on the frame, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came before entering any place that smelled like fear. Then he pushed it open. The lobby was narrow, with a mismatched row of plastic chairs and a bulletin board crowded with posters and lost pet notices. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 30s straightened from sorting a stack of forms. She was of medium height, a little soft around the middle, with a tired ponytail of dark blonde hair and a face that might have been pretty if worry and lack of sleep hadn't etched it down. Her eyes, a pale blue, flicked over him quickly, taking in the plaid jacket, the worn boots, the way he held himself like someone more used to helmets than winter hats. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice practical but not unkind. "Saw your flyer at the fire station," Daniel said. His voice sounded rougher than he meant it to. "German Shepherd. Dangerous. End of the week deadline." Something in her shoulders slackened in recognition. "Right. Him." She set the forms aside with a small sigh. "You sure you don't want a nice sleepy old Labrador instead? We've got 3 of those." It was a joke, but there was a test inside it. The way people tested fences without looking like they were pulling. "Let me at least meet him," Daniel replied. He wasn't in the habit of promising things he wasn't sure he could do. The woman nodded and came around the counter, wiping her hands on the legs of her scrub pants. Up close, he could see a faint ring of indentation on her ring finger, pale against the rest of her skin. Either a divorce or a widowhood. He couldn't tell, and didn't pry. "Name's Carrie," she said over her shoulder as she pushed through the swinging door into the kennels. "I do the intakes. I've been trying to talk myself into not feeling guilty if we have to let this one go." The sound hit him first. A layered chorus of barks and whines, sharp and desperate, bouncing off cinder block walls. The kennels lined both sides of a central aisle, each a rectangle of concrete and chain link, most holding dogs that surged to the front at the sight of a person. One small terrier danced on its hind legs. A hound with drooping ears bayed mournfully. Only one cage in the far corner seemed still. "Back there," Carrie said, nodding. "He came in 3 weeks ago. Was a working dog somewhere out of county. They brought him back with a note that said, 'Too much, too hard to control.' Didn't bother to send records." As they walked, Daniel noticed a red laminated sign zip-tied to the front of one kennel door, its color bright against the dull metal. "Dangerous," it read in block letters. "Do not open without supervisor." Beneath it, someone had added a smaller sticker. "Experienced handlers only." The dog inside was not at the front. He was curled in the back corner where the concrete met the wall, a dark knot of fur and bone. His coat was a deep sable, patches of tan at his legs and muzzle, but dulled now with shelter dust. One ear bore a nicked edge, the kind of small scar that spoke of time and work rather than one dramatic fight. Faint white lines traced his front leg where old cuts had healed. At the sound of their approach, an eye opened. Rich, dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and fixed on them without the frantic brightness of the others. "Hey, big guy," Carrie said softly. She kept a respectful distance from the door, hands loose at her sides. "Company?" The dog did not rise. He merely shifted, bringing his head up from his paws just enough to see better, ears flattening slightly at the red sign on his own door as if he understood what it meant. "He ever lunge?" Daniel asked quietly. Old habits made him catalog risk, distance, posture, points of escape. "Once," Carrie admitted. "First night. Some idiot banged on the gate thinking it was funny. He went for the front of the kennel. Honestly, I think he was trying to scare him back, not get through. Since then, he mostly shuts down when people come through. Then we check the cameras at night and find the bedding rearranged, the water bowl moved, toys shoved around like he's pacing half the dark." She exhaled. "He's been trained. You can see it. Sits like he's waiting for orders that aren't coming. Daniel stepped a little closer. Not enough to crowd, just enough that the dog could catch his scent if he wanted to. Up close, the animal smelled of clean straw and the metallic tang of kennel life. "They say he's dangerous," Carrie went on, glancing at the red sign. "We have to put that up because of the incident report. Liability and all. Truth is, most of the staff are afraid of him now. Big dog, bad label. They feel safer not looking too long." Dangerous, Daniel thought again, watching the slow, measuring blink of that dark eye. He had seen true danger, unthinking rage, panic, eyes rolled white. This was something else. This was a creature who had learned that movement and attention brought trouble, who now chose stillness like a shield. He saw, too, the tiniest flicker when he shifted his weight. The dog's gaze followed the movement, not with a predator's calculation, but with a soldier's unspent readiness. "Does he have a name?" Daniel asked. "Came in with one we can't get him to answer to," Carrie said. "The officers who dropped him off just called him that shepherd." She rubbed her forehead. "I wish I could tell you he's a safe bet. I've seen him look at the door, like he's measuring how fast he could reach it if it opened." "Can you open it?" Daniel said. At her quick look, he added, "Just a crack. I won't go in." Carrie hesitated, then nodded, unhooking a lead from the wall. She clipped it to the gate before unlatching, making a loop of nylon between her and the kennel door. When she eased it open an inch, the dog did not explode forward. He lifted his head fully, nose working, taking in the cooler air from the aisle, the scent of a man who smelled faintly of oil, metal, and old smoke. "Easy," Daniel murmured, more out of habit than necessity. The dog's eyes met his then, properly, for the first time. What he saw there was not wildness. It was exhaustion wrapped around a core of sharp, stubborn intelligence, like coals banked under ash. Something in Daniel's chest shifted, a small, almost painful recognition. He knew what it was to be penned up with your own training and no mission, to feel people move past you with a mix of fear and dismissal. "Shadow," he said, the word surprising even himself as it left his mouth. It felt right, though, something that stayed close and went unnoticed until it chose to move. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, just barely. Carrie caught it too, her eyebrows lifted. "You thinking?" "Paperwork," Daniel said. "What's it look like if I take him?" "Like me sleeping a little better at night," she answered before she could stop herself, then gave a short, self-conscious laugh. "There's a fee, home check, basic stuff. But honestly, if you're serious, I'll drive the forms to your house myself." An hour later, the forms were signed, the red sign removed, and the big shepherd, Shadow now, whether he knew it yet or not, stepped tentatively into the weak sunlight, a shelter-slip lead looped around his neck. He walked beside Daniel without pulling, head low, as if unsure the ground under him would hold. Across from the storage yard where Daniel worked sat a small diner with fogged-up windows and a chipped blue door. It smelled like coffee, fried eggs, and a dozen winters. As Daniel crossed the street with Shadow at his side, the door swung open and Ellen Moore leaned out to shake a rag. Ellen was about Daniel's age, maybe a year younger, with silver threading through her dark brown hair, which she kept twisted up with a pencil. Her figure was sturdy in a pale blouse and flowered apron, and her face held the kind of worn prettiness that came from years of smiling, more than frowning. Laugh lines bracketed her mouth. A faint sadness lingered at the corners of her eyes, the sort that said she'd lost someone and learned to keep going anyway. "Well now," she called, voice warm with curiosity and concern. "That the dog from the flyer?" She set the rag over her shoulder and stepped out onto the stoop, crossing her arms against the chill. "You sure about this, Daniel? I've heard folks saying he's trouble." "I've heard folks say that about me, too," he replied, attempting a half-smile. It tugged at his mouth in a way that felt out of practice. Ellen huffed a soft laugh, then reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a crinkly plastic bag. "Got some dog biscuits from the supplier by mistake. Figured I'd save them for a brave soul." She crouched a little, extending one towards Shadow with an open palm. "What do you think, big fella? Truce?" Shadow's head stayed lowered, amber eyes cutting sideways to her hand, then to the street, then back again. He did not step forward. His nose flared once, catching the scent of flour and beef and the faint, comforting smell of diner grease. But he made no move to take the treat. His body remained coiled, weight centered, as if ready to spring, not toward the biscuit, but away from it at the slightest wrong move. Daniel watched the subtle movements others might miss. The quick, sharp flick of one ear when a pickup 3 blocks away shifted gears, the way his tail stayed low but not tucked, a line of caution rather than terror. Every time a car turned onto their street, Shadow's ears twitched, tracking the sound, cataloging it. He was not shutting the world out. He was studying it, the way a man might study the layout of a room with his back to the wall. Ellen slowly withdrew her hand, not offended, brushing crumbs from her palm. "That's all right," she said softly. "We've got time to be friends." She straightened, giving Daniel a look that held both worry and a kind of quiet respect. "You holler if you need anything, you hear? Coffee's on me for anyone brave enough to bring that boy home." As she disappeared back into the warm glow of the diner, Daniel stood on the cracked sidewalk with Shadow at his heel, feeling the weight of the leash in his hand and the weight of the choice he'd made. Beside him, the dog scanned the street again, muscles relaxed just enough to suggest he was not entirely braced for disaster. And Daniel couldn't help wondering if this animal was truly as broken as the label had claimed, or if, like certain men who avoided fireworks and crowded rooms, he was simply waiting to see whether the world in front of him was finally one worth trusting. The next few days settled into a kind of tentative rhythm, the way a song feels when 2 musicians are still learning to trust each other's timing. In the mornings, Daniel walked across the street to the diner with Shadow trotting at his side, the dog's thick tail hanging low but not tucked, his paws careful on the frost-slick sidewalk. The bell over the blue door jingled as they stepped inside, bringing with them a gust of cold and the smell of winter air. Ellen would glance up from the coffee pots, that pencil still pinning her silver-streaked hair, and give them both a small, pleased nod, as if their arrival confirmed something good about the day. "My 2 favorite early birds," she'd say, voice light but eyes watchful on Shadow. "Table by the windows open." Daniel spent the slower hours between breakfast and lunch helping where he could. He wiped tables, repaired a wobbly chair leg, changed a humming fluorescent tube in the back hallway. It wasn't his job, officially, but it felt better to be useful than to sit at home alone with the TV murmuring. Shadow learned quickly that his place, during those hours, was beneath the corner table nearest the counter. He would ease himself down on the scuffed linoleum, long legs folding neatly, head resting between his paws. From that vantage point, he could see both the front door and the pass-through to the kitchen. He rarely moved, even when plates clattered or someone laughed too loud. But his eyes tracked the room in slow, steady sweeps. The regulars noticed, of course. They were mostly older folks. Men with soft middles and weathered hands, women in thick cardigans and sensible shoes, who came in for the coffee and the comfort of telling the same stories to the same faces. One morning, a wiry man in his 70s with a sun-leathered face and a cap, advertising some long-closed feed store, squinted down at Shadow as he shuffled past. His name was Roy, and he had the shambling gait of someone whose knees had more miles on them than they liked to admit. "That's a whole lot of dog to be that quiet," Roy remarked, hooking a thumb toward the table. "Big fella like that where I grew up, we'd have chained him to a truck." Ellen rolled her eyes as she topped off his mug. "Times change, Roy. We chain fewer things and talk more to 'em now." She shot Daniel a sideways grin. "This one just likes to pretend he's a rug." A woman at the next table, Mrs. Green, mid-60s, soft gray curls, lipstick always a shade too bright for breakfast, leaned over to get a better look. "Oh, he's an angel," she declared. "I told you, Dan. Dangerous, my foot. Look at him. You'd have to step on his tail to get him to notice you." Under the table, Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of his own reputation being discussed. But he did not lift his head. Daniel, watching from the counter where he was tightening a loose screw on the napkin holder, saw the tiny muscles working along the dog's shoulders, the way his breathing stayed slow and even despite the noise around him. Calm was a choice Shadow made, not an absence of alertness. When the lunch rush came, Daniel walked back across to the storage yard, Shadow padding beside him until they reached the fence. "You stay with me till closing," Daniel said one afternoon, more to hear how it sounded than because the dog needed the instruction. He'd brought in a worn blanket and an old thick bed from a thrift store. Shadow had sniffed them over and then settled by the small office doorway as if they'd always been his. At night, when Daniel finally locked the last unit and turned off the yard lights, the world dropped into a quieter kind of dark. The first time the nightmare hit after Shadow arrived, it came without warning, the way storms sometimes rolled across the plains faster than the forecast predicted. Daniel was back in the desert before he knew it, the taste of dust in his teeth, the whoop-whoop of a helicopter hammering the sky overhead. Someone was shouting for a medic, hands slick with blood, and no matter how hard he pressed down, the life beneath his palms kept leaking away. He woke with a strangled gasp, sweat cold at his hairline, heart ricocheting inside his chest. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The dark of the bedroom felt too tight, too close. He groped for the lamp switch, then froze halfway. The corner where he'd set up Shadow's bed, a folded blanket with one of his old sweatshirts thrown on top, was empty. The sweatshirt lay undisturbed, the faint sag where a body should have been already fading. Daniel's pulse kicked harder, this time not with remembered fear, but with the sharp awareness that something in the present wasn't where it should be. The house was quiet, too quiet. No scrabble of claws on wood, no soft huff of a dog shifting in sleep. Then he noticed the slim rectangle of darker shadow at the far end of the hallway. The back door, not fully closed. Every sensible thought told him that if Shadow had wanted out, he would have scratched or whined. But the door hung ajar as if someone with paws and brains enough had nudged it open just enough to slip through. Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed, joints protesting, and reached automatically for his plaid jacket. The fabric was cool under his fingers, familiar as his own skin. He shrugged it on over his t-shirt, the weight of it oddly steadying, and stepped into his boots without bothering with socks. The night air hit him as soon as he eased the door the rest of the way open, cold, with the faint metallic scent of frost and distant exhaust. The yard lamps at the storage lot were off. Only the security light over the office door shed a weak cone of yellow into the dark, barely touching the rows of metal units that stretched out like silent train cars. For a moment, Daniel just listened. Somewhere a truck downshifted on the highway. A dog barked 2 streets over. Closer, there was the faint scuff of movement on gravel. He followed the sound, feet remembering every rut and dip in the path between his back door and the chain-link gate. The lock clicked under his hand, and then he was inside the fenced yard, the darkness thicker, the silence edged with a kind of held breath. Shadow moved into view between two rows of units, a darker shape against the gray. He padded slowly along the line of doors, nose close to the thin gap at the base of each one, breathing in and out with deliberate care. At each unit he paused, head tilted, ears pricked toward whatever small sounds lay beyond the walls. Rodents, old motor oil, the ghost smells of cardboard and furniture. When he reached a lock, he leaned in, sniffing the metal itself as though cataloging the tang of fresh fingerprints separate from rust. Daniel watched, unseen, as Shadow worked. There was nothing random about it. The dog traced the perimeter the way Daniel had once watched perimeter patrols traced around makeshift camps. Thorough, methodical, no corner overlooked. When a loose scrap of trash skittered across the lot on a breeze, Shadow pivoted toward it instantly, body low, then relaxed again when he identified it as harmless. It was when he reached Unit 27, an old, long unrented space Daniel knew for a fact had been empty for years, that something in the dog's pattern changed. Shadow stopped in front of it and stayed there. He pressed his nose to the bottom edge, inhaled once, twice, then lifted his head slightly and simply listened. His whole body went still, not in the false way he lay under the diner table, but in the true, statuesque stillness of a sentry who thinks he might have heard something at the wire. Daniel felt a prickle along his own spine. He knew that unit, had checked it for leaks himself after a hard rain last spring. There shouldn't be anything in there for a dog to care about. But Shadow remained at the door, eyes on the seam where metal met frame, as if waiting for it to breathe wrong. After a long minute, whatever answer he'd been waiting on didn't come. The dog exhaled, a soft, resigned huff, and moved on, finishing the loop of the yard with the same precise thoroughness. When he finally turned back toward the house, Daniel stepped quietly out of sight and slipped ahead of him, back through the gate and into the kitchen, heart oddly tight. By the time Shadow's claws clicked softly on the back steps, Daniel was already sliding into bed, lamp off, breath slowed to something that pretended sleep. He heard the door nudge open, the small pause as Shadow checked the room. Then the weight of the dog easing back onto his bed in the corner, accompanied by a deliberate rustle of fabric as if to say, "I have been here all along." Staring up at the ceiling, the ghost of sand and rotor wash fading from his mind, Daniel realized his nightmares were not the only thing pacing the dark in this town. And for the first time, he wondered not just who had trained Shadow to guard so carefully, but what kind of danger the dog still half expected to come walking out of the night toward them. The next time Shadow slipped out into the night, Daniel was ready for him. He lay in the half-dark, listening to the familiar sequence. The soft exhale of the dog rising from his bed, the almost noiseless pad of paws crossing the worn floorboards, the faint click of toenails on the back step, and then the whisper of the door easing inward and outward again. Instead of waiting this time, Daniel swung his legs over the side of the bed as soon as the night swallowed Shadow's shape. He pulled on his plaid jacket and boots with movements careful enough not to creak the old boards, a man who knew how to move in the dark without announcing himself. The air outside was colder than the last time, the sky a bowl of deep ink scattered with hard stars. He let the door sigh almost shut behind him and kept back a good distance, following the faint shadow of the dog as it flowed ahead of him across the patchy grass toward the storage yard. Shadow didn't look back, but Daniel had the uncanny feeling the dog knew exactly how far behind he was and had decided, for his own reasons, not to object. At the chain-link gate, Shadow did what he'd done before. Nudged the lower corner with his nose, where Daniel never bothered to tie the extra length of wire, slipped through the small give in the metal, and padded into the maze of units. Daniel let himself in at the proper latch, the lock clicking quietly under his fingers. He stayed just inside the fence for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, tracking Shadow by sound more than sight. The soft scrape of paws on gravel, the occasional jingle of the loose metal tag on the dog's collar. Shadow traced the line of doors, as he had on the night of the nightmare. But this time Daniel watched from closer in. The dog's route was the same. Along the first row, pause, sniff, listen. Cut across the lane, repeat along the second. There was a discipline to it that made Daniel's skin prickle, the same slow, methodical pattern he'd seen in patrols walking the outer ring of a camp under threat. When Shadow reached Unit 27, he stopped again. This time, he didn't just press his nose briefly to the base of the door. He stood there for a long breath, then turned aside to the corner where the concrete floor met the back wall of the neighboring unit. Daniel frowned. He knew that stretch of floor. He'd swept it himself. It was unremarkable. Plain, cold, a place where dust collected. Shadow began to scrape gently at the edge with one paw, not in the frantic tearing way of a bored dog, but with delicate testing strokes, claws clicking lightly as if searching for purchase. Daniel felt the urge to step in, to hiss a quiet, "Leave it." But something in the dog's intent focus stopped him. The scraping changed, a muted, different sound, and Daniel realized there was a hairline crack in the concrete he'd never noticed. A thin seam where something man-made ended and something else began. After a few more careful swipes, the corner of a small panel shifted, just enough for Shadow to work his paw underneath and flip it back with a soft, gritty pop. Beneath, a shallow cavity yawned, no deeper than a couple of hands laid side by side. Shadow drew back, giving Daniel a clear view, then looked over his shoulder, eyes gleaming faintly in the dark as if to say, "This is what you needed to see." Daniel crouched beside the opening, knees complaining, and reached in. His fingers brushed canvas, the rough weave of a small drawstring bag. It smelled of oil, dust, and something faintly metallic, like coins or old batteries. He eased it out into the open and untied the stiff cord. Inside, his hand closed around the shapes of several cell phones, older models with scuffed screens and no cases. Beneath them were folded papers, a photocopied street map of their town with certain blocks marked in red pen, and a handwritten list on lined notebook paper. He pinched the top of the list between thumb and forefinger, careful not to smear anything, and tilted it toward what light he had. Names were scrawled down the page, each with an address and a time. The third line down read, "Ellen's Diner, Main and 5th, 7 to 10 a.m. A twist of cold slid into the space behind his ribs. Ellen's place. Mrs. Green's bright lipstick, Roy's grumbling jokes, the clatter of cups, and the soft thump of Shadow's breathing under the table. All reduced here to a blunt entry on a stranger's list. Farther down, he saw storage lot, Hartley Nunn Nights, underlined twice. His own last name, spelled right. Someone had done homework. Shadow shifted beside him, head low but eyes fixed steadily on the items in Daniel's hand. The dog's body language was a paradox, relaxed enough to stay, tense enough that every muscle seemed one question away from motion. He's seen this before, Daniel thought. Or something like it. A stash, a cache. Places where people with bad intentions left worse ones to be picked up later. "Who were you working for, boy?" Daniel murmured, not expecting an answer. Shadow's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, then forward again, gaze sliding to the dark beyond the fence, as if the night might be listening too. Daniel replaced the items in the bag, then, on second thought, took the map and list out and folded them into his jacket pocket instead. The empty phones went back into the canvas sack. He retied it, set it gently back into the cavity, and lowered the concrete panel almost all the way, leaving it just slightly askew. Enough, he hoped, that if someone came looking, they'd assume it had shifted on its own, but not immediately notice the absence of paper. He straightened slowly, feeling the weight of the folded pages against his chest like an extra heart. "Come on," he said softly. "That's enough excitement for one night." Shadow fell into step beside him as they left the yard, neither pulling ahead nor lagging behind. Back in the house, the dog circled once on his bed and lay down with a soft sigh. Daniel lay awake longer, staring into the dim, going over the list in his mind until the names blurred. By morning, he had convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, he could take a day to think before deciding who to show the papers to. The universe did not grant him that day. Late the next morning, the diner was its usual hum of low conversation and clinking cutlery. Ellen moved between tables with practiced ease, her floral apron catching the sunlight that spilled through the front windows. At a corner booth, her grandson Milo sat coloring in a battered activity book, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Milo was 8, thin as a rail, with a mop of unruly brown hair and serious dark eyes that only sparkled when Ellen set a slice of pie in front of him for quality control. Shadow lay beneath Daniel's table in what had become his usual station, front paws crossed, eyes half-lidded. To anyone glancing over, he looked like part of the furniture. The bell over the door rang, and 2 men stepped in. They didn't belong to the usual crowd. The first was in his early 40s, lean and a little too sharp around the edges, with a closely shaved jaw and hair clipped short on the sides, longer on top and gelled back. His eyes were a pale, watchful gray, set deep beneath straight brows, and they moved around the room the way a man's eyes move when he's counting exits. He wore a dark jacket over a hoodie and jeans that had seen hard use, boots scuffed but laced tight. The second man was broader, maybe late 30s, with a heavy jaw shadowed in stubble and a nose that had clearly been broken more than once. His hair was dark and cropped close, and his eyes, a muddier brown, slid over surfaces without appearing to settle, as if cataloging without wanting to be caught at it. "Help you, boys?" Ellen asked, coming forward with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hand tightened slightly on the coffee pot handle. "Just coffee," the first man said easily, voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Heard you're the only place open this side of town before noon." They took stools at the counter, but their posture was wrong for men intending to stay. They sat light, not relaxing into the vinyl, knees angled like runners on the blocks. As Ellen poured, the gray-eyed one nodded toward the window, where the storage yard sign was just visible across the road. "Busy over there at night?" he asked, making it sound like idle talk. "Can't imagine there's much call for towing in a town this size." "Depends on the weather," Ellen said. "Snow and bad brakes keep them hopping." She set cups down with a clink. "Why do you ask?" The man shrugged. "Saw the lights on a couple nights when we were passing through. My buddy here was saying it'd be an easy gig, falling asleep in a chair while everybody else did the real work." He gave a thin smile. "That old soldier that watches the place, he ever nod off?" Daniel, at his table, felt the question like a draft under a closed door. His hand tightened slightly around his fork. Under the table, Shadow's head came up. "Daniel does his job just fine," Ellen replied, the warmth in her voice cooled by a faint steel. "And if he didn't, Half this town would be out of luck when their cars wouldn't start. The second man, the broader one, swiveled on his stool just enough to let his gaze drift toward the back of the diner, where the hallway led to the rear exit. "You keep a key to those units over here?" he asked. "Just curious how folks get in if they need something late." "Folks don't," Ellen said. "They wait till morning like everybody else." Milo slid out of the booth then, small sneakers squeaking softly. He wandered closer to the counter, one hand still clutching his crayon. The gray-eyed man's gaze flicked down to him and then, briefly, to the back door again. That was all it took. Shadow flowed out from under the table in one smooth movement and placed himself between Milo and the men, his body a solid wall of fur and muscle. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood, weight balanced, head level, eyes fixed on the nearer stranger with a steadiness that made something in the room tighten. The line of his back bristled slightly, hackles lifting just enough to be seen by anyone paying attention. Milo, sensing the change in the air, instinctively reached out and curled his fingers into the loose skin at Shadow's neck, half hiding behind the dog's shoulder. The broader man's boot scraped as he took an unconscious half-step back. "Easy there," he muttered. "Didn't mean nothing." The gray-eyed one lifted his hands a fraction off the counter, palms out, the picture of harmlessness, but his eyes had gone a shade flatter. "That your dog, old-timer?" he called over to Daniel, attempting a chuckle. "Big fella like that? You sure he's under control?" Daniel met his gaze, feeling every year in his bones and every scar in his memory, and thought of the map folded in his jacket drawer at home, the list with Ellen's diner and his own name on it, the hidden bag in the hollow under the concrete. His answer wouldn't just be about a dog. It would be about a choice. Between pretending this was all coincidence and admitting that trouble had finally followed Shadow home. And as he watched the way Shadow's body formed a quiet shield around a skinny 8-year-old boy, he realized that whichever path he chose next would drag not only himself, but everyone in this small, fragile orbit into the open. Daniel didn't go to the sheriff that same night. He waited until the sky had swapped its stars for a washed-out winter blue, and the town had shaken off sleep enough that knocking on a lawman's door didn't feel like an alarm bell. Shadow watched him pull on his jacket and pick up the folded map and list from the drawer, dark eyes tracking each movement with a seriousness that made Daniel feel absurdly like he was being inspected for courage. The sheriff's office sat just off the square, a brick building with a chipped seal over the door and a flag that cracked in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and copier toner. Sheriff Ray Collins looked up from his desk when Daniel stepped in, the lamplight catching on the silver in his close-cropped hair. Collins was in his early 60s, barrel-chested and a little thick around the middle, with a face that might have been jovial if not for the permanent bracket of worry around his mouth. His eyes, a steady hazel, had the weighed-down look of a man who'd seen more than one kind of trouble pass through a small town. "Morning, Dan," he said, pushing his glasses up onto his forehead. "Everything all right at the lot?" Daniel hesitated, then laid the folded papers on the desk between them. "Found something I don't like," he said. He explained enough. The hidden stash under the unit, the bag, the phones. He kept his voice steady, his details sparse. He did not say that a dog had led him to it, like a bloodhound trained on secrets. When Collins opened the map and the list, his expression shifted from polite interest to a thin, grim line. "That's my handwriting," he said quietly, tapping one address. "From the neighborhood watchboard." He skimmed farther down, jaw tightening when he saw Ellen's Diner and Hartley Nights. "Who else has seen this?" "Just me," Daniel replied, "and whoever put it there in the first place. You touch anything else?" Left the bag, took the paper. Collins grunted, half approval, half worry. Smart enough. We'll run the phones, see if any numbers pop. I'll have a patrol car swing past the diner and your lot a little more. But listen, Dan. Until I know whether this is some fool's prank or something bigger, try not to go playing hero. Call us first if you see those men again. I'm nobody's hero, Daniel said, more sharply than he meant to. Collins studied him for a heartbeat, then nodded. Didn't say you were. Just don't want any more names on lists than we already have. For a few days after that, the town settled back into its winter routine, like a pond surface smoothing after someone dropped a stone. Patrol cars did appear more often, their light bars dark as they rolled slowly past the diner and the storage yard. Ellen noticed, of course, and gave Daniel a questioning look one afternoon. He shrugged and muttered something about holiday shoplifting uptick, weak joke that made her snort, but didn't completely erase the small furrow between her brows. Shadow's behavior shifted in ways someone else might not have clocked. He spent longer at the windows in the evening, nose near the glass, ears forward as he listened to passing cars. When Daniel walked his usual rounds at the lot, the dog stayed closer at his heel, body angled slightly outward as if ready to put himself between his person and anything unexpected. At the diner, Shadow still lay under the table, but his eyes flicked more often toward the door. He was a living barometer, and the pressure, somewhere, was dropping. The night it broke, Daniel almost convinced himself he was imagining the first sign. It was late. The storage yard had been quiet, except for one old pickup needing a jump, and the sky over the town had turned a heavy, starless black. Ellen usually closed the diner around 9 on weekdays. Most nights, sometime between lights out and bed, she'd call his cell for a few minutes of end-of-day chatter. A new pie recipe gone wrong, something silly Milo had said, the way Roy had argued with the jukebox. That phone call came often enough that its absence rang all on its own. By 10:30, with no call and no familiar glow from the diner's front windows across the way, the silence began to itch. Daniel sat in his small living room, the television murmuring some late-night infomercial he wasn't really watching. Shadow paced. The dog moved from door to window, then back again, nails clicking a soft, restless rhythm on the floor. He stood with his head lifted, nostrils flaring, as if catching something faint on the air the human nose couldn't parse. "Settle down," Daniel said once, more out of habit than irritation. Shadow paused, flicked an ear in his direction, and then resumed his loop, tail low but not tucked, muscles tight along his flanks. A low, almost inaudible whine escaped him when he paused by the front door for the 3rd time. The weight in Daniel's gut shifted from unease to a sharper, colder thing. "All right," he muttered, reaching for his keys. "We'll go look." Shadow was at the truck before the words finished, leaping into the passenger side as soon as the door opened. On the short drive toward Main Street, the dog couldn't seem to decide between sitting and standing. He braced his front paws on the dash at one point, nose near the windshield, breath fogging a small patch of glass as his eyes strained toward the dark hump of buildings ahead. The town's main strip looked wrong as soon as they turned onto it. The streetlights cast their usual cones of pale yellow. But the diner, which usually held a lingering warmth like a lantern even after closing, sat dark and flat against the night. No glow at the windows, no neon open sign winking half-heartedly. The parking lot was empty. Daniel pulled into the narrow alley that wrapped around the back of the building, his headlights sweeping over the trash cans and the back steps. Shadow gave a sharp high bark, a sound Daniel had not heard from him before, as the beams caught the back door. The frame was splintered near the lock, wood ragged where something metal had forced its way in. Daniel killed the engine. For a second, he just sat there, hands on the wheel, listening to the sudden roar of his own pulse in his ears. The smell hit him as soon as he opened the truck door. A sour, chemical ghost of gasoline fused with the faint, acrid tang of something scorched. Not a full burn, no blackened walls, no flames licking the sky. But a warning, like a match struck and then blown out, just short of kindling. Shadow was out of the truck and at the back steps in a flash, nose down, drawing in the scent with quick, sharp breaths. The fur along his spine rose, a ridge of bristles under Daniel's hand when he reached to steady him. "Easy," Daniel murmured, though his own voice sounded far from calm. The kitchen beyond the busted door was dark, shapes of tables and countertops barely etched by the streetlight leaking in behind them. Daniel flicked on his phone's flashlight and swept the beam in a controlled arc. No bodies, no movement. Chairs were knocked slightly askew, one cup shattered on the floor near the sink. The lingering smell of gas was stronger inside, making his throat scratch. On the prep counter by the back wall, weighted down with a salt shaker as if to keep it from fluttering to the floor, lay a crumpled piece of paper. Shadow reached it before he did, front paws planted, head low as he sniffed at the edges. Daniel's hand shook just enough that the light jittered when he lifted the paper. The words were scrawled in thick black marker, all capitals. No attempt at disguise. "Bring the dog and the keys to the old train depot. Tonight. No cops. Or the lady in this place turned to ash." A smear of something brownish, oil, dirt, he didn't want to guess, smudged the lower corner. For a heartbeat, all Daniel could see was another kind of fire. Orange roaring up into a desert sky, heat pressing in so hard it felt like hands. The helicopter's belly had been a dark circle above him, lights flashing, too far, too late. The weight in his arms back then had been a man, not a piece of paper. But the sick, hollow stretch between needing to move and not knowing how was exactly the same. He swallowed, the taste of old smoke rising from the back of his memory like it had been hiding there, waiting. Behind him, Shadow's breath warmed the back of his hand where it clutched the note. The dog stood close enough that Daniel could feel the steady thud of his heart through that broad chest, fast but not wild, ready but not panicked. Shadow looked up at him, eyes dark and steady, and in them, Daniel saw not just a trained animal waiting for a command, but a kind of question. Are we running from this? Or toward it? Ellen's laughter seemed to echo faintly off the empty diner walls. Milo's skinny shoulders, hunched over a coloring book, flickered across his mind's eye. The worn red booths, the smell of coffee, the way the place had become, against his better judgment, a sort of home. His fingers tightened on the paper until it crinkled. Once, years ago, he had backed away from a wall of flame because the pilot above him had ordered a retreat, because someone somewhere had decided the risk was too high. He had obeyed, and a man who had trusted him had not come out. Now, the fire was only a threat on paper. But the fear felt just as real. Standing in that dark kitchen with gasoline ghosts in the air and a dog at his side who had already chosen where to stand in a fight, Daniel understood that whatever he did next would decide whether he spent the rest of his life running from 2 nights of fire instead of 1. The old train depot sat at the edge of town like a forgotten thought. A squat brick building slumped beside twin lines of rusted rail that went nowhere. Moonlight skimmed off the steel in dull streaks, turning the tracks into a pair of faded scars across the hard ground. Daniel pulled his pickup to a stop a good distance away, killing the headlights so the night could close back over them. The engine's ticking faded, and for a moment all he heard was his own breathing and the slow thud of his heart. Beside him, Shadow stood already in the open door, body silhouetted against the pale sky, nose lifted toward the depot. The dog's tail hung still, not wagging, not tucked, just a straight line of readiness. "All right," Daniel murmured, as much to himself as to the dog. "Let's go see who thinks they own you." He stepped down onto the gravel, plaid jacket pulled tight against the chill. The familiar weight of the storage lot keys heavy in his pocket. His boots crunched softly. Shadow moved at his side, close but not crowding, matching his pace without needing a word. The depot's loading platform loomed ahead, its wooden planks dark with age. One of the old freight lamps still hung crookedly above the platform door, unlit, a black eye socket staring down. Closer now, Daniel saw the shapes the note had promised. 2 figures tied to a support post near the edge of the platform, and 3 others scattered nearby like pieces on a board, all of them wearing ball caps pulled low. Ellen sat with her back against the rough wood, arms pinned behind the post, ankles bound. Even in the weak moonlight, he could see smudges of dirt on her cheek, a torn sleeve on her blouse. Her hair had come loose from its knot, dark strands hanging around her face. Milo was pressed into her side, smaller body lashed to the same post, his head tipped down as if he'd fallen asleep, but twitching now as Daniel approached. His thin shoulders jerked once, then stilled, bravely trying to be small. The 3 men turned as one when gravel shifted under Daniel's boot. The one in the middle stepped forward a pace. He looked to be mid-40s, solidly built, but gone a bit to seed, with a square jaw and stubble that did nothing to soften the hard line of his mouth. The brim of his cap cast his eyes in shadow, but when he smiled, it didn't touch them. "Right on time," he said. "Old soldiers are punctual, if nothing else." On his right stood a narrower man, early 30s maybe, with a beak of a nose and nervous hands that couldn't quite be still, fingers worrying the edge of his jacket. On the left, a taller, wirier shape shifted its weight from one foot to the other, head tilted, watching. A thin scar ran from the corner of that one's mouth to his chin, catching a streak of moonlight like a white thread. Near Ellen and Milo, 3 plastic gas cans sat lined up in a neat row, their red sides dull, black caps glinting. The smell of fuel was stronger here, a sharp sting in the back of Daniel's throat. "You brought what we asked for?" the leader asked. His gaze flicked to Shadow, then to the bulge of keys in Daniel's jacket pocket, then back again. The dog and the keys. That was the deal. The word deal scraped over Daniel's nerves. He shifted just enough to put himself halfway between the men and the post where Ellen and Milo were tied. Shadow moved with him, not ahead for once, but slightly angled so that one flank brushed Daniel's leg and the other lined up between him and the gas cans. "You start with the boy," the narrow man muttered to the leader, pitched too low for a casual ear, but not for Shadow's. The dog's ears tipped back, then forward again, his head lowering a fraction. The leader lifted one hand slightly. "Relax," he said. "Nobody needs to get hurt if we do this clean." His tone turned almost conversational as he focused fully on the dog. "Funny seeing you again, huh?" he drawled. "Didn't think we'd lose you to some charity shelter. You remember, don't you?" He took a step closer and called a different name into the night, sharp and commanding, a single word that had never passed Daniel's lips. Shadow's reaction was instant and visceral. The dog's entire frame tightened, ears flattening half a heartbeat before snapping upright, tail lowering until it was level with his hocks. A tremor ran along his shoulders, not of fear, but of deep, old memory rising. Drills in concrete yards, shouted orders, the sting of a leash jerked hard, the smell of sweat and gun oil. His eyes darkened, fixed on the man who'd spoken, as if seeing not just the figure in front of him, but 100 repetitions of that voice in other, harsher places. "See?" the leader said, glancing sideways at his companions with a smug little tilt of his head. "You don't just walk away from training like that. Dog like this is an investment. We put years into him. Tracking, guarding, crowd work. Knows how to hit a man so he doesn't get back up. We take him, we clear our little storage issues from your lot, and this sleepy town goes back to pretending it's safe. Everybody wins." His right hand dipped briefly to pat the pocket where a lighter bulged, fingers lingering there. Daniel's gaze caught the small betraying flicker in that hand. The faint tremor of someone who wasn't nearly as calm as he wanted to appear. It was the same tremor he'd seen once on a corporal trying to light a flare with mortar bombs landing too close. Fear threaded through arrogance. He felt something inside him shift, slow and steady, like a gear finally catching the teeth it had missed for years. The desert fire in his memory was still there, but now it was overlaid with this place. A ramshackle depot. A woman who made him coffee without asking how he took it. A skinny boy who trusted his dog enough to hide behind him. And a German shepherd whose first instinct had been to stand between trouble and a child. "You don't own him," Daniel said quietly. His voice surprised him. It sounded steadier than he felt. "Not anymore." The leader snorted. "Old man, you brought him here on our say-so. That leash in your hand? Might as well be ours." Daniel looked down at Shadow. The dog's collar gleamed dull around his thick neck, the leash running from it to Daniel's hand. In another life, another night, he'd held a different line. A radio cord, a man's belt as a tourniquet, the strap of a stretcher. Tonight, this was the line that mattered. Slowly, deliberately, he unclipped the leash. The tiny metal click sounded loud in the cold air. His fingers slid just under the leather of the collar, feeling the warm pulse beneath fur. He leaned close enough that his breath stirred the dog's ear. The word he whispered was simple, one every working dog knew. But this time it carried not the sharp crack of command, but the weight of trust. Protect. Shadow's muscles bunched under his hand. For a heartbeat, he was motionless. Energy coiled tight. Then he exploded forward. He didn't go for the nearest man. He went straight for the lighter. The leader had just started to pull it from his pocket when 90 pounds of trained muscle hit him center mass. The man's breath left him in a startled grunt as he went down hard, back slamming against the platform boards. The lighter flew from his hand, skittering away into the gravel with a useless spark. One of the gas cans tipped as they collided, glugging a thin line of fuel across the boards that shone slick in the moonlight, but did not ignite. The scarred man to the left swore and yanked a handgun from under his jacket, arm coming up in a jerky arc toward the blur of fur and flannel. Shadow twisted mid-movement, placing himself squarely between the weapon and Daniel, with a speed that made the world narrow for a second into a series of frozen frames. Dog, gun, Ellen's wide eyes, Milo's small body straining against ropes. Daniel moved. Years fell away from his joints as his body remembered what to do when someone pointed metal at his people. He dropped sideways off the line of fire and into it at the same time, closing the distance in a low, driving surge. Shadow's shoulder brushed his thigh as the dog lunged at the gunman's wrist, teeth snapping closed not on flesh, but on the thick sleeve just below the hand, jerking it upward. The shot went off wild into the dark, the crack of it ricocheting off the depot walls like a cruel echo of past battles. Daniel's hand clamped down on the man's forearm, twisting, leveraging momentum and surprise. The gun came free with a wrench. He shoved the man backward with the same motion, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The nervous one had gone for a knife, but the sight of his leader gasping and his partner disarmed sent him stumbling a step too slow. Shadow, ears ringing, pivoted toward him with a guttural bark and charged, just close enough to make the man flinch and drop the blade as he scrambled away on his hands for a few panicked feet. "Don't!" Daniel barked, and the man froze, breath coming in short bursts. In the sudden lull, Daniel could hear the faint wail rising on the wind from town. Sirens, distant but drawing closer, a thin line of sound threading through the night. Working quickly, hands steadier now that the worst moment had passed. He grabbed the fallen rope from one gas can, yanked it free, and used it to bind the scarred man's wrists, then the leader's, rolling each onto his side with efficient, impersonal pushes. He kicked the knife farther away, pocketed the gun with the safety on, and finally moved to Ellen and Milo. Shadow was there first, planting himself between them and the three groaning men. Chest heaving, one foreleg held just a little lighter off the ground, where a bullet or a wild splinter had grazed him. His hackles were still up, but his eyes, when Ellen reached a shaking hand to his cheek, softened. "Hey, boy," she whispered, voice raw. "You did good. You did so good." Daniel's fingers fumbled only once on the knots as he freed them. Milo went straight to Shadow, small arms wrapping around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in fur that smelled now of cold air and gasoline and a thin tang of cordite. Shadow stood rock still, accepting the weight, the praise, the unspoken thanks. Over the sound of the approaching sirens, Ellen looked up at Daniel. Her face was streaked with grime and fear, but her eyes were clear. "You came," she said simply. He swallowed, the ghost of old smoke finally loosening its grip on his lungs. "Couldn't let another fire have its way," he answered. As blue and red lights began to flicker faintly against the low clouds beyond the depot, Daniel glanced at Shadow, at the slight limp, the steady gaze, the dog's body still angled between danger and the people he'd chosen. In that moment, with the night not yet finished, but the worst of it behind them, he knew they had just rewritten an ending that had burned a hole in him for years. But he had no idea what kind of life started for a man and a dangerous dog after surviving a night like this together. By the time the March wind softened and the snowmelt had finally stopped making little rivers along Main Street, the old train depot at the edge of town was just another story people told over coffee. It sat out there the way it always had, bricks slumped, rails rusty. But now, when someone mentioned it inside Ellen's diner, they did it with a shake of the head and a glance at the corner booth, where a red and black plaid jacket usually hung over the back of a chair and a big German shepherd slept under the table. Ellen told the story the most, because the town kept asking. She stood behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s with laugh lines, deeper now than her worry lines, waving the coffee pot as she talked. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was always tied up in a loose knot, and sometimes when she got to the part about the gas cans and the lighter, her hand trembled just a fraction and she had to set the pot down. "I tell you," she'd say, voice catching somewhere between a laugh and a shiver, "I've never been so glad to see a beat-up pickup and that silly old jacket in my life." The regulars, men and women with white hair and slow, careful movements, would cluck and mutter and then start in on their teasing. "Ought to give that man a shiny helmet and a badge," Roy would grumble from his perch by the window, pushing his thick glasses up his nose. "Daniel and that dog of his, honorary fire department, that's what I say." Someone else would add, "Town's own rescue squad," and they would all look over to where Daniel sat, pretending to be absorbed in the menu he'd long since memorized. He would shake his head, mouth tugging into that small, reluctant smile that had started to visit his face more often. "I just drove," he'd say. "Dog did the hard work." Under the table, Shadow would huff a soft sigh, as if embarrassed by the attention, and rest his head on Daniel's boot. The little scar along Shadow's foreleg had faded to a thin, pale line, hidden under fur that had grown back thick and glossy. He didn't limp anymore. If anything, he walked with more purpose, as if some part of him had settled into knowing exactly where he belonged. Whenever Milo burst out the back door of the diner after school, a narrow 8-year-old in a too-big sweatshirt, hair sticking up in 3 different directions, Shadow rose from whatever patch of floor he'd been warming and fell into step beside him. Out in the cracked asphalt behind the diner, where someone had painted a crooked 4-square court decades ago, the boy and the dog made their own games. Milo dribbled a faded ball. Shadow tracked its path with his eyes, but never cut in unless invited, matching his pace so a small hand could rest easily along his neck. To anyone watching from the kitchen window, Shadow looked less like a dangerous working dog and more like an older brother who happened to have paws and a tail. At night, when Daniel closed up the storage yard and walked the quiet line of doors, the shadows no longer looked like ambushes waiting to happen. They were just shadows. He still wore the plaid jacket, still checked the locks, still listened to the wind moving around the corrugated metal. But the tight band that used to wind itself around his chest during those lonely circuits had loosened. The nightmares came less often, too. Some mornings he woke with his heart steady instead of racing, the remembered roar of rotor blades replaced by the softer sounds of a house that was no longer as empty. The tick of the kitchen clock, the creak of floorboards as Shadow padded from window to door on his own unhurried patrol. On more mornings than not, he ended up at the diner early, not because he couldn't sleep, but because there was someone there who set out 2 mugs automatically, one in front of his usual seat, and one a little to the side where a large dog could angle his head for a splash of cool water. Inside, the coat rack had acquired a new habit. Daniel's plaid jacket hung there most days, and next to it, as if by some unspoken agreement, Ellen's floral apron. They brushed each other whenever someone reached for either one, the flannel and the cotton moving together like 2 people who had finally learned to share a small, stubborn space. Neither of them made a fuss about it. Ellen still fussed at him for tracking in mud, and Daniel still grumbled about her letting the coffee get too strong after 11. But there was a gentleness under the banter now, a familiarity that made his shoulders drop an inch when he walked through the door. Being needed, he'd decided, didn't always look like dragging a man out of a firefight. Sometimes it looked like fixing a flickering neon sign, or walking a kid home at dusk, or being the steady weight on the other end of a leash that had once led a dog into all the wrong places. It was Sheriff Collins who first suggested turning part of the storage yard into something more than rows of rented rooms. They stood together one afternoon near the back fence, hands in their pockets, watching Shadow trot along the perimeter with Milo and 2 other neighborhood kids trailing after him like ducklings. "We've got folks calling from the next county over," Collins said, his hazel eyes narrowed against the low sun. "Heard what that dog did. Got pups nobody wants. Older dogs that need a job so they don't end up put down for being too much. Seems to me we've got ourselves a trainer." Daniel snorted softly. "You volunteering?" Collins shook his head. "I'm talking about the 4-legged veteran and the 2-legged one," he replied. "You know how to read a room, Hartley, human or otherwise." The idea settled into Daniel's mind the way a seed finds a crack in the pavement. Within a week, he was clearing out the far corner of the lot, sweeping dust from a unit that had sat empty longer than he could remember. He strung a tiniest length of chain link along one side to make an exercise pen, laid down old tires and makeshift obstacle bars, and hammered a simple wooden sign into the gravel at the entrance. Shadow's Watch. The name hadn't been his. The town had chosen it. A mason in his 70s carved the letters, his knotted hands surprisingly steady as he worked. Kids dropped coins and crumpled bills into a jar on Ellen's counter under a handwritten note that read, "For our dogs, second chances," while the church ladies organized a bake sale that sold out of pies in under an hour. Nobody was trying to build an empire. They were just trying to build a place. On the first Saturday, they opened the pen. 3 dogs showed up. A shaggy mix with more energy than manners, a nervous hound with ribs too sharp under his skin, and an older shepherd whose owner had died and who watched everything with wary, golden eyes. Shadow walked among them with unhurried grace, sniffing, circling, then dropping into a playbool so exaggerated that even the anxious hound couldn't resist taking a few tentative steps forward. "He's doing your job for you," Ellen murmured from where she leaned against the fence, arms folded, apron still dusted with flour. Daniel stood inside the pen, jeans dusty, boots planted. "That's the way I like it," he said, watching Shadow redirect the exuberant pup away from the hound with a gentle shoulder bump. A small cluster of children, Milo among them, stood along the fence line, listening as Daniel talked about how to approach a scared dog, how to watch ears and tails, how respect was the first trick anyone should learn. His voice was calm, patient, with only the faintest rasp left from smoke that belonged now more to memory than to the present. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the storage units across the yard, Daniel took a moment to look around. Ellen chatting with Sheriff Collins over paper cups of coffee. The kids laughing when the shaggy mix finally mastered stepping through a tire. Shadow pacing the edge of the pen with the slow, satisfied air of someone on duty where he wants to be. Once, he had thought his story had burned out at that far-off fire, leaving only ashes and a life built around avoiding anything too bright or too hot. Now, watching a dog who'd once been written off as dangerous gently guide another injured soul toward trust, he understood that some fires didn't destroy, they tempered. Ellen caught his eye and smiled, a soft, knowing curve of the mouth that said she saw the change in him, even if he never put it into words. Shadow, sensing his attention, trotted over and leaned his weight lightly against Daniel's leg, accepting a hand on his neck as if it had always belonged there. The rails out by the old depot still rusted in the weeds, but here, in this little corner of town, 2 lives that had been told they were too broken had found work worth doing, people worth standing guard over, and a quiet, everyday kind of peace that felt, finally, like home. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with trumpets and angels. Sometimes they pad in on tired paws, with a scar on one leg and a label that says, "Dangerous." And still, he uses them to guard a little diner, to heal an old soldier's heart, and to remind a whole town that no soul is ever too broken for a second chance. If God can redeem a lonely veteran and a dog everyone else gave up on, he can touch the quiet, hurting places in our everyday lives too. In our kitchens, in our empty rooms, in the moments we feel no one needs us anymore. If this story stirred something in you, would you share it with a friend who loves dogs, veterans, or simple small-town miracles? Leave a comment below and tell us about the shadow in your life, the person or animal God used to protect you, or to bring you back to hope when you needed it most. And if you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He watch over your home, your family, and the animals that share your days. Thank you for watching. And may God's gentle protection walk beside you, just like Shadow walked beside that old veteran, in every step of your everyday life.